Welcome back to the Iceberg of British Colonies, Part 2. In the previous video, we explored the first 3 levels of the iceberg, uncovering the most well-known and visible parts of the British Empire's legacy, from India and Canada to Malta. But now, we're diving even deeper into the forgotten, the controversial, and the truly buried parts of colonial history. If you haven't seen Part 1 yet, tap the card in the top right corner to watch it first. It covers the first 3 levels of the iceberg and gives you all the context before we dive deeper. Let's begin. Level 4. Deep Waters. North Borneo, Sabah. At the northern tip of the island of Borneo, nestled between the South China Sea and the Sulu Sea, lies Sabah, formerly known as British North Borneo. Unlike its larger neighbors like India or Australia, North Borneo was never fully integrated into the heart of the British Empire, but it played a key role as a resource frontier, rich in timber, tobacco, and oil. British involvement began in 1881, not through direct government conquest, but through a private company, the British North Borneo Chartered Company. Similar to the early days of British India under the East India Company, this private corporation was granted the right to administer the territory, collect taxes, and exploit its resources. The company established Sandakan as its capital and quickly began extracting Borneo's rich natural wealth, particularly hardwood timber, from its dense rainforests. The population of North Borneo was ethnically diverse, made up of indigenous groups such as the Kadazandusun, Murut, and Bajau, along with Chinese and Filipino migrants drawn by trade and labor opportunities. British rule was relatively light compared to other colonies, with the company focusing more on commercial gain than deep administrative control. However, North Borneo's position on the edge of Asia made it vulnerable during World War II. In 1942, Japanese forces invaded and occupied the territory, subjecting it to brutal rule until Britain liberated it in 1945. After the war, the company handed over administration to the British Crown, and North Borneo became a formal British colony in 1946. In 1963, North Borneo joined Malaysia, along with Malaya, Sarawak, and Singapore, which later separated. It was renamed Sabah, becoming one of Malaysia's 2 states on the island of Borneo. Today, Sabah is known for its biodiversity, tropical rainforests, and oil reserves, but its colonial past still lingers in land disputes and economic imbalances between local communities and external developers. Its history as a commercially driven, company-administered territory highlights yet another way the British Empire expanded, not just through conquest, but through corporate colonialism. Sierra Leone. Among all of Britain's African holdings, Sierra Leone stands apart as a colony founded with a moral mission, at least on the surface. While most imperial ventures sought land, resources, and power, Sierra Leone began as a province of freedom, established in 1787 as a settlement for freed and rescued slaves. Yet this noble vision quickly became entangled in the same patterns of exploitation and control that defined much of the British Empire. Located on the West African coast, Sierra Leone was deeply tied to the transatlantic slave trade. British abolitionists, eager to create a sanctuary for freed slaves, sponsored the first settlement of freed black people from Britain and North America. These settlers, known as the Black Poor or Nova Scotians, were soon joined by Maroons from Jamaica and recaptured Africans freed from illegal slave ships by the British Navy. In 1808, Sierra Leone became a crown colony, with Freetown, its capital, serving as a base for Britain's anti-slavery patrols. On paper, it symbolized the empire's humanitarian turn. In practice, it became a segregated and controlled society where the British ruled through governors and military force, keeping the freed populations under tight colonial authority. Beyond Freetown, British influence expanded into the interior, where they signed treaties with local chiefs, but often used military campaigns to enforce control. The Hutt Tax War of 1898, a rebellion against colonial taxation, was brutally suppressed, marking the shift from a humanitarian project to a standard colonial administration. Sierra Leone's economy remained underdeveloped, focused on palm oil, diamonds, and agriculture. Despite its early promise as a model of black self-governance, real power stayed in British hands. Sierra Leone gained independence in 1961, but the divisions sown during colonial rule between the Creole, descendants of freed slaves, and the indigenous ethnic groups would later fuel political instability and civil war. From 1991 to 2002, Sierra Leone endured one of the most brutal conflicts in African history, marked by mass atrocities and the use of child soldiers. Today, Sierra Leone continues to rebuild, but its legacy as Britain's moral experiment serves as a reminder that even the most well-intentioned imperial projects were ultimately shaped by power, control, and exploitation. British Guiana, Guyana. While much of the British Empire expanded across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, British Guiana, now known as Guyana, represented Britain's only significant mainland colony in South America. Tucked between Venezuela, Brazil, and Suriname, this small territory became a plantation economy built on slavery, indentured labor, and geopolitical rivalry with other European powers. Britain seized control of the territory from the Dutch in 1814, formally establishing British Guiana. The fertile coastal plains and river valleys were quickly turned into sugar plantations, powered by the forced labor of enslaved Africans. Like in Jamaica and Barbados, the sugar wealth came at a horrific human cost. Slavery was abolished in 1834, but rather than grant true freedom and land to former slaves, the colonial authorities turned to indentured labor, importing tens of thousands of Indians, Chinese, and Portuguese workers to replace the freed African labor force. This created a deeply divided society, split primarily between Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese communities, divisions that still define Guyanese politics and identity today. British Guiana also served as a buffer zone in imperial geopolitics. Border disputes with Venezuela flared throughout the 19th century, with Britain expanding its claims deep into the interior. The Venezuelan boundary dispute of 1895 nearly brought Britain and the United States to conflict, but was resolved through international arbitration, mostly favoring Britain. Despite its rich resources, including bauxite, gold, and timber, British Guiana remained economically underdeveloped. Its colonial economy benefited a small elite, while the majority of the population faced poverty and limited political power. In the 1950s and 60s, British Guiana became a Cold War battleground, as Britain and the United States sought to prevent the rise of leftist, pro-socialist leaders like Chetty Jagan. Fearing a second Cuba, Western powers intervened politically, delaying full independence until 1966, when the country was renamed Guyana. Today, Guyana is on the verge of a new economic transformation, following the discovery of massive offshore oil reserves. Yet, the country's colonial legacy of ethnic division, political instability, and underdevelopment continues to shape its future. St. Helena, Ascension, and Tristan da Cunha. While other colonies of the British Empire were built on trade, agriculture, or military power, St. Helena, Ascension, and Tristan da Cunha served primarily one purpose: control of the oceans. Scattered across the South Atlantic, these remote islands formed a naval network critical to Britain's global dominance in the Age of Sail. The most famous of the three, St. Helena, was claimed by Britain in 1659 as a resupply station for ships traveling between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Its fame skyrocketed in 1815 when Britain chose the island as the final prison for Napoleon Bonaparte, exiling the former French emperor there until his death in 1821. Its isolation made escape impossible, turning it into history's most notorious island prison. Further north, Ascension Island, claimed in 1815, became a key naval garrison and coaling station, used to support anti-slavery patrols along the African coast and later to project naval power across the Atlantic. Its barren volcanic landscape made it uninhabitable until Britain transformed it into a strategic military outpost. The most remote of them all, Tristan da Cunha, was claimed in 1816 to prevent the French from using it as a base to rescue Napoleon. Located over 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continent, it became known as the most isolated human settlement on Earth. Its small population, descended from shipwreck survivors and early settlers, lived by fishing and farming in near-total isolation for generations. While these islands never became major economic centers, they were vital stepping stones in Britain's imperial network, allowing ships to refuel, resupply, and maintain communication across vast oceanic distances. Today, these islands remain British overseas territories, with tiny populations and economies based largely on fishing, limited tourism, and satellite tracking stations. Their extreme isolation has made them largely self-reliant communities, preserving a unique maritime heritage. Though they lack the fame of India or the wealth of South Africa, St. Helena, Ascension, and Tristan da Cunha stand as living relics of an empire that once ruled the seas, not through vast cities or plantations, but through tiny outposts in the middle of nowhere, anchoring Britain's reach across the globe. Zanzibar, Tanzania. Off the coast of modern-day Tanzania, the island of Zanzibar was one of the wealthiest and most notorious slave trading centers in the Indian Ocean long before the arrival of the British. Ruled for centuries by Arab sultans from Oman, Zanzibar was famous for its spice plantations, especially cloves, and for its central role in the East African slave trade, where countless men, women, and children were shipped to markets across Arabia, Persia, and beyond. Britain's entry into Zanzibar's affairs began in the 19th century as part of its anti-slavery mission. In 1822, Britain pressured the Sultan of Oman to sign the Moresby Treaty, which restricted, but did not end, slave trading. Over the following decades, Britain increased its influence, pushing the Sultan to abolish the slave trade entirely. However, this was more than a humanitarian project. Britain was also interested in controlling the gateway to East Africa, securing commercial interests, and countering rival European powers. In 1890, Zanzibar officially became a British protectorate, while still nominally ruled by the Sultan. Britain's influence was so complete that when a succession crisis arose in 1896, the British launched the shortest war in history, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, which lasted less than 40 minutes. A new British-approved Sultan was installed almost immediately. Under British control, Zanzibar shifted from a slave economy to a plantation economy centered on spices, particularly cloves, making it one of the world's top exporters. While Britain ended the public slave markets, the social and economic structures built on slavery remained for years. In 1963, Zanzibar gained independence from Britain, but remained a monarchy under the Sultan. Just 1 year later, a revolution overthrew the Sultan's government, leading to the deaths of thousands of Arab and South Asian residents. Zanzibar then merged with Tanganyika to form the modern nation of Tanzania. Today, Zanzibar is known for its white sand beaches, rich Swahili culture, and spice exports, but its legacy as a slave-trading hub and British protectorate remains a complex chapter in East Africa's colonial history. Christmas Island, Indian Ocean. Far from the centers of imperial trade and conflict, Christmas Island, located in the Indian Ocean, south of Java, was never a major colony in terms of population or political power. Yet its strategic location and rich deposits of phosphate made it a small but valuable asset in Britain's vast network of resource colonies. Discovered by Europeans on Christmas Day in 1643, the island remained largely ignored until the late 19th century, when large reserves of phosphate rock, a crucial ingredient for fertilizer, were discovered. Britain annexed the island in 1888, incorporating it into the Straits settlements, which also included Singapore, Penang, and Malacca. The phosphate mines were quickly exploited by British and Australian companies. To operate the industry, Britain imported laborers, primarily from China and Malaysia, who worked under harsh and dangerous conditions. Much like other colonial mining operations, the wealth generated from Christmas Island's resources flowed back to British and Australian interests, while the workers lived in segregated and tightly controlled settlements. Administratively, the island was governed from Singapore, and few Britons actually lived there. It remained a quiet industrial outpost, known more for its phosphate exports than for any political or cultural significance. Following World War II, the island's strategic location gained new importance as Cold War tensions rose in the region. However, by 1958, Britain transferred Christmas Island to Australia, which continued the phosphate mining operations for decades. Today, Christmas Island is better known for its unique wildlife, particularly its famous red crab migration, when millions of crabs cross the island to spawn in the ocean. It remains an Australian territory, with a small population of fewer than 2,000 residents, many of whom are descendants of the original Chinese and Malay laborers. Though small and remote, Christmas Island stands as another example of how the British Empire's reach extended to even the most isolated places, driven not by settlement or culture, but by resource extraction and strategic control. Pitcairn Islands. Tucked away in the vast South Pacific Ocean, the Pitcairn Islands are among the most isolated human settlements on Earth, a tiny volcanic archipelago that became one of Britain's strangest and most unique colonial possessions. The islands are best known as the home of the mutineers from HMS Bounty, and their story reads more like a legend than a typical imperial conquest. In 1790, after the infamous mutiny on the Bounty, where British sailors overthrew their captain, William Bligh, a group of mutineers, along with several Tahitian men and women, settled on Pitcairn Island to escape British justice. For years, the outside world lost track of them, believing they had disappeared or perished. It wasn't until 1808 that an American ship rediscovered the community, finding just one surviving mutineer, John Adams, living with the descendants of the original group. By the 19th century, Britain recognized Pitcairn as a formal colony, though its population never exceeded a few dozen people. The British saw it as a moral curiosity, a Christian society descended from criminals who had somehow created a stable, if tiny, community. In 1856, due to overpopulation, Britain relocated the entire population to Norfolk Island, east of Australia. However, several families later returned to Pitcairn, unwilling to abandon their ancestral home. Pitcairn's economy remained minimal, based on subsistence farming, fishing, and later, stamps and handicrafts sold to passing ships. Its extreme isolation, thousands of kilometers from the nearest continent, meant it relied heavily on British support for supplies and communication. In the 21st century, Pitcairn became the focus of international headlines when several residents were convicted of sexual abuse, revealing dark secrets in the island's tight-knit society. The scandal raised difficult questions about how isolated communities manage law, justice, and governance. Today, the Pitcairn Islands remain a British overseas territory with fewer than 50 residents. They are governed by a British-appointed administrator, though daily life is largely self-managed by the tiny community. Though they hold no economic or strategic value today, the Pitcairn Islands remain a symbolic relic of Britain's global reach, proof that the empire once extended its flag to even the most remote corners of the planet. British Somaliland. On the Horn of Africa, along the coast of the Gulf of Aden, lay British Somaliland, a territory that played a quiet but strategic role in Britain's imperial ambitions to control maritime trade routes between Europe, the Suez Canal, and India. Though less developed than other parts of the empire, it served as a buffer zone and a coaling station in the age of steamships. Britain established control over the territory in 1884, partly to counter French and Italian colonial expansion in the region and to protect British interests in nearby Aden, modern-day Yemen. Unlike other African colonies, British Somaliland was sparsely populated, with a predominantly nomadic Somali population that resisted foreign control. Rather than investing in large-scale infrastructure or plantations, the British ruled indirectly, relying on treaties with local clans while keeping a light administrative presence. The region's harsh desert climate and lack of natural resources made it economically marginal, but its coastline provided a strategic foothold on the southern entrance to the Red Sea. Tensions simmered for decades, especially as Somali nationalists began resisting British influence. The most notable resistance came from Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, dubbed the Mad Mullah by the British, who led a 20-year armed campaign against British and Ethiopian forces from 1899 to 1920. His dervish state became a symbol of Somali resistance, though it was eventually crushed by British military campaigns, including the use of aerial bombardment, one of the earliest examples of air power used in colonial warfare. During World War II, Italian forces briefly occupied British Somaliland in 1940, integrating it with Italian Somaliland. However, British troops retook the territory in 1941, re-establishing colonial rule. In 1960, British Somaliland gained independence, but within days chose to merge with Italian Somaliland to form the Somali Republic. However, the union soon proved unstable. In 1991, following the collapse of Somalia's central government, the former British territory declared itself independent as Somaliland, a self-declared republic that remains unrecognized internationally to this day, despite maintaining relative peace and stability compared to the rest of Somalia. British Somaliland's story is one of imperial neglect, resistance, and unresolved identity, a reminder that colonial boundaries drawn for convenience often left behind long-lasting divisions still shaping the Horn of Africa today. Level 5. The Abyss, British Antarctic Territory. At the bottom of the world, where ice and wind dominate a frozen, lifeless landscape, lies one of Britain's most peculiar and least inhabited claims, the British Antarctic Territory, BAT. Unlike other colonies built on labor, trade, or military conquest, this claim is purely about strategic presence, scientific research, and geopolitical influence. Britain first asserted sovereignty over parts of Antarctica in 1908, claiming the Falkland Islands dependencies, which included areas of the Antarctic Peninsula and surrounding islands. These claims were later redefined in 1962 as the British Antarctic Territory, stretching from the South Pole to the 60th parallel south, between longitudes 20°N and 80°N. There is no permanent population, no plantations, no settlers. The British presence in Antarctica has always been scientific and symbolic. Research stations such as Rothera and Halley serve as outposts for studying climate change, glaciology, wildlife, and atmospheric science. These bases are maintained by the British Antarctic Survey, one of the world's leading polar research institutions. However, Britain's claim is disputed. Several countries, including Argentina and Chile, have overlapping claims in the same region. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, signed by dozens of nations, effectively froze all territorial claims, preventing new claims or the expansion of existing ones. The treaty designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve, banning military activity and commercial exploitation of its natural resources. Yet the geopolitical interest in Antarctica persists, especially as climate change and resource scarcity raise questions about the continent's untapped mineral and energy reserves beneath the ice. While the Antarctic Treaty currently protects the region from exploitation, its future remains uncertain, and Britain's long-standing claim keeps it at the table of international negotiations. Today, the British Antarctic Territory stands as the largest but least populated of all Britain's overseas holdings. It represents not colonial conquest in the traditional sense, but Britain's ongoing ambition to remain a player in the governance of Earth's final frontier, the frozen, fragile wilderness of the Antarctic. Chagos Archipelago, Diego Garcia. In the vast Indian Ocean, thousands of kilometers from the African coast, lies the Chagos Archipelago, a cluster of tiny coral islands that became one of the most controversial military outposts of Britain's modern imperial legacy. Its most famous island, Diego Garcia, remains a critical U.S. military base to this day, but few know the human cost behind its transformation. Originally part of Mauritius, the Chagos Archipelago was separated by Britain in 1965, just before Mauritius gained independence. Britain created a new colonial entity called the British Indian Ocean Territory, BIOT, which included the Chagos Islands. This move was made under pressure from the United States, which sought a military base in the region to project power during the Cold War. Between 1968 and 1973, in what many describe as ethnic cleansing, Britain forcibly removed the entire Chagosian population, descendants of African and Indian laborers who had lived on the islands for generations. They were relocated to Mauritius, the Seychelles, and Britain, often in poverty and without compensation. The official British narrative claimed they were temporary workers, but testimonies and historical records revealed that they had deep roots, homes, and a distinct culture in the islands. With the population gone, Britain leased Diego Garcia to the United States, which built a massive naval and air base used during operations in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and the Gulf Wars. Today, Diego Garcia is one of America's most important overseas military installations, hosting bombers, surveillance aircraft, and naval fleets. The displaced Chagosians have spent decades fighting for the right to return. International courts, including the International Court of Justice, ICJ, in 2019, ruled that Britain's continued control of the islands is illegal, stating that they should be returned to Mauritius. Despite this, Britain has refused to relinquish control, citing security agreements with the U.S. The Chagos Archipelago stands today as a symbol of modern colonialism, where strategic military interests overrode human rights and international law. Its story is a reminder that the legacy of empire is not confined to history. It continues to shape lives and international relations in the present. Falkland Islands. Set in the cold, windswept waters of the South Atlantic Ocean, the Falkland Islands, or Islas Malvinas, as they are known in Argentina, remain one of the most geopolitically charged territories in Britain's post-imperial portfolio. While the islands themselves are small, with a population of just a few thousand, they have become a symbol of national pride for both Britain and Argentina, leading to one of the last colonial-era wars of the 20th century. Britain first claimed the islands in 1765, but they changed hands multiple times between the French, Spanish, and later Argentina, which declared independence from Spain in the early 19th century. In 1833, Britain reasserted control, establishing a small, permanent British population primarily of sheep farmers. Despite their remote location and harsh environment, the islands remained strategically valuable as a naval station and later for their rich fishing grounds and potential oil reserves. For decades, Argentina maintained that the islands belonged to them, citing their geographic proximity and colonial inheritance from Spain. Britain, on the other hand, viewed the self-identified British population of the Falklands as having the right to remain under British sovereignty. Tensions erupted in 1982 when Argentina's military junta invaded the islands, hoping to boost domestic popularity through nationalistic fervor. Britain, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, responded by launching a full-scale military operation. After 74 days of conflict, the British retook the islands, with 649 Argentine and 255 British soldiers killed. The war solidified British control but left deep scars on Argentine-British relations. Argentina continues to claim sovereignty, and the issue remains a diplomatic flashpoint to this day. In a 2013 referendum, over 99% of Falkland Islanders voted to remain British, reinforcing the UK's position that the people's right to self-determination should prevail. Britain maintains a permanent military garrison on the islands, ensuring they remain securely under UK administration. Today, the Falklands have a stable economy based on fishing, tourism, and limited oil exploration. Yet their true significance lies not in their economic output, but in what they represent, a living legacy of colonial-era boundaries, national pride, and the enduring human cost of imperial disputes. British New Guinea, Papua. In the late 19th century, as European powers scrambled for control over the Pacific, Britain laid claim to the southeastern quarter of the island of New Guinea, today known as Papua. This territory, later called British New Guinea, was Britain's easternmost colonial frontier in the Pacific and a stepping stone in the wider rivalry between Britain, Germany, and the Netherlands over Oceania. New Guinea, the second largest island in the world, was already divided. The Dutch claimed the western half, now part of Indonesia, while Germany had taken the northeastern quarter in 1884. Britain, fearing German expansion toward Australia, quickly declared a protectorate over the southeastern portion of the island that same year. By 1888, it became a formal British possession, administered as British New Guinea. However, unlike other parts of the empire, Britain showed limited interest in turning Papua into a major economic colony. The region was geographically isolated, covered in dense jungles, mountains, and rugged coastlines. Few settlers arrived, and the British administration was light, primarily focused on preventing other powers from encroaching closer to Australia. In 1906, Britain transferred control of British New Guinea to Australia, renaming it the Territory of Papua. This move symbolized Britain's gradual delegation of Pacific responsibilities to its dominions, particularly Australia, which viewed Papua as part of its regional sphere of influence. During World War II, Papua became a critical battleground as Japanese forces advanced through the Pacific. Australian and American troops fought intense jungle warfare in campaigns such as the Kokoda Track, which became a defining moment in Australia's military history. After the war, Papua was administratively united with the former German colony of New Guinea, which had been transferred to Australian control after World War I. The two territories eventually gained independence as Papua New Guinea in 1975, becoming one of the newest nations to emerge from Britain's imperial past. Today, Papua New Guinea is known for its cultural and linguistic diversity, home to over 800 languages, making it one of the most culturally complex nations on Earth. Its brief chapter as British New Guinea reflects Britain's strategic rather than economic interest in the Pacific, showing how imperial borders often shaped nations that would later define themselves in entirely different ways. Kiritimati, Christmas Island, Pacific Ocean. Located in the central Pacific Ocean, Kiritimati, also known as Christmas Island, is part of the Republic of Kiribati today. But in the mid-20th century, this tiny coral atoll became one of the most infamous testing grounds for nuclear weapons in British history, one of the last places where the empire projected military power on a truly global scale. Kiritimati was first claimed by Britain in 1888, grouped with the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony, modern-day Kiribati and Tuvalu. For decades, it remained uninhabited and largely ignored, used occasionally as a stopover for ships and by guano miners extracting phosphate-rich bird droppings. Its remote location and large flat lagoon seemed unremarkable until the Cold War. In the 1950s, as Britain raced to maintain its status as a nuclear power, Kiritimati was selected as a nuclear test site. From 1957 to 1962, Britain, in cooperation with the United States, conducted nuclear bomb tests on and around the island. Soldiers, scientists, and local laborers were stationed there to carry out the detonations, many of which involved air-dropped hydrogen bombs, the most powerful weapons ever tested by the UK. These tests, while framed as scientific and military necessities, exposed thousands of personnel and potentially nearby Pacific populations to radiation hazards. Veterans and island workers later reported long-term health effects, including cancer and birth defects, though the British government denied direct responsibility for years. In 1979, Kiritimati became part of the newly independent nation of Kiribati, which remains one of the world's most vulnerable countries to climate change and rising sea levels. Today, Kiritimati is home to a small fishing and tourism-based population, known for its bird life and bone fishing rather than military significance. The island stands as a symbol of Britain's late imperial military ambitions, where remote colonial territories were used as expendable proving grounds in the geopolitical chess game of the Cold War. Its legacy is a reminder that the empire's reach didn't end with decolonization, but continued into the nuclear age, leaving behind environmental scars that remain part of the Pacific's hidden history. Newfoundland. Long before Canada became the vast dominion we know today, Newfoundland stood as Britain's oldest permanent colony in North America, with a history that stretches back to the early 17th century. This rugged island in the North Atlantic was central to Britain's early colonial ambitions, built not on land conquest or plantations, but on fishing, particularly the highly lucrative North Atlantic cod trade. British and European fishermen had been sailing to Newfoundland's rich fishing grounds since the 1500s, but it was in 1610 that Britain formally established a permanent settlement at Cupid's, marking the island as one of the empire's earliest colonial ventures. Over the centuries, Newfoundland developed as a fishing colony, its economy revolving almost entirely around cod, which was salted and shipped back to Europe. Newfoundland's geography made it strategically significant. Its position at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River made it a gateway to mainland Canada and a naval outpost for controlling North Atlantic shipping lanes. However, its harsh winters, rocky soil, and isolation meant that large-scale agriculture or settlement never took hold as it did in other parts of British North America. For centuries, Newfoundland remained separate from Canada, governed as a British colony and later as a self-governing dominion from 1907. It even fought as an independent dominion during World War I, where the heavy losses suffered by the Royal Newfoundland Regiment became a defining moment in the island's national memory. Despite its status as a dominion, Newfoundland faced severe economic challenges during the Great Depression. Crippling debt and widespread poverty led the government to voluntarily suspend self-government in 1934, returning control to a British-appointed commission. After World War II, Britain pushed Newfoundland toward joining Canada, believing it would ensure the island's economic and political stability. In 1949, after a heated and divisive referendum, Newfoundland officially joined Canada as its 10th province. Today, Newfoundland and Labrador, the mainland portion of the province, are celebrated for their distinct cultural identity, shaped by centuries of isolation, fishing traditions, and British colonial heritage. While no longer a separate dominion, Newfoundland's story remains one of the earliest and longest-lasting chapters in Britain's colonial history in North America. British Campeche, Yucatán. One of the most obscure and short-lived British colonial ventures occurred in the Yucatán Peninsula of modern-day Mexico, in an area historically known as Campeche. Though rarely mentioned in discussions of the British Empire, Britain's fleeting influence in this region highlights the gray zones of colonial expansion, driven not by formal conquest, but by commercial exploitation and opportunistic occupation. In the 17th and 18th centuries, British settlers, mostly logwood cutters from Belize, then British Honduras, began venturing into parts of the Yucatan coast to harvest valuable dyewood trees, which were used in European textile production. These baymen, as they were known, operated in a legal gray area, often clashing with Spanish authorities who viewed the region as their uncontested domain. While Britain never formally declared Campeche a colony, British loggers established semi-permanent camps, defended their interests with armed militias, and traded with local indigenous groups. Spain repeatedly tried to expel these British settlers, leading to skirmishes and diplomatic tensions between the two empires. However, Britain never secured official sovereignty over the region. The Treaty of Versailles in 1783 and subsequent agreements between Britain and Spain attempted to resolve these disputes. Britain agreed to limit its logging activities to what is now Belize, abandoning its claims and operations in Campeche and the broader Yucatan Peninsula. While Britain's direct presence in Campeche ended quietly, its logwood trade legacy lived on in the economy of Belize, which remained a British colony for nearly 2 more centuries. Campeche itself continued as part of Spanish and later Mexican territory. Today, Campeche is a Mexican state rich in Mayan history, colonial architecture, and natural resources. Its brief and largely forgotten encounter with the British Empire is a reminder that not all colonial ventures succeeded, and that the boundaries of empire were often defined as much by failed ambitions as by lasting control. British Florida. Though often forgotten in the narrative of the British Empire, Florida, now one of the most iconic U.S. states, was once a British colony. Its place in the empire was brief and contested, but it played a strategic role in Britain's rivalry with Spain and France during the 18th century. Britain gained control of Florida in 1763 following its victory in the 7 Years' War, which saw Britain expand its colonial holdings at the expense of France and Spain. In the Treaty of Paris, 1763, Spain ceded all of Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana, Cuba, which Britain had captured during the war. Britain divided Florida into 2 colonies: East Florida, with its capital at St. Augustine; West Florida, with its capital at Pensacola. Unlike Britain's other American colonies, Florida had a sparse population consisting mostly of Spanish settlers, Native American tribes, and a small number of British colonists. To encourage settlement, Britain offered land grants and religious tolerance, attracting settlers from other parts of North America and the Caribbean. However, Florida's strategic value lay less in its economy and more in its position along the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic, serving as a buffer against Spanish Louisiana and the expanding United States. British forces fortified the region, but it never achieved the population or prosperity of the 13 colonies to the north. When the American Revolution broke out in 1775, Florida remained loyal to Britain, serving as a base for Loyalist refugees and military operations against the rebelling colonies. Yet Florida's loyalty earned it little reward. In the Treaty of Paris, 1783, which ended the war, Britain returned Florida to Spain as part of the peace settlement, marking the end of its 20-year colonial experiment in the region. Florida's brief time under British rule left behind fortifications, roads, and legal land titles, some of which shaped later American expansion into the territory. By 1821, Spain ceded Florida to the United States, ending centuries of European contest over the region. Today, Florida's British chapter is little remembered, overshadowed by its later history as part of the United States. Yet, for 2 decades, it stood as one of Britain's southernmost American outposts, caught between imperial ambition and colonial rivalry, before quietly slipping back into the hands of Spain. The British Empire shaped the world, uniting, dividing, and leaving marks that still echo today, from India to the Antarctic. Its legacy is still felt across borders, cultures, and conflicts. If you enjoyed this journey through history, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which story surprised you the most. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next